Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers, and it's broadcast number 716, August the 26th, 1985. For those of you who want bibliography sheets of this broadcast with the sources of information, you can write to me, Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922. For those of you who subscribe to the broadcast and get the accompanying sheets that go with them, I have put a black dot after the news items which involve deaths, specifically murders, because when I read my news stories, often hidden in articles are references to primary witnesses that have been killed, people that have been killed, even though the lead story doesn't bring up that subject at all. And so I put those black dots right by the side of that article, in that same article, just to see how many they're talking about and the circumstances. And there were so many deaths that I wanted to update with you now and share that I just went ahead and put black dots so you get an idea of what is going on. And each dot doesn't even represent mass murders like 30 people for one item or 11 for another. I just put one dot to mean deaths. There was a story in the New York Times Sunday, August 18th, Brazil unearthing corruption by military regime. The president-elect was murdered down there. The new president that came in was formerly with the military dictatorship for 20 years. But they seem to be going along the lines of investigating, which they have to do because the country is going bankrupt, with flight capital leaving and diamond scandals and jewels and cash gone and the banks emptied. They're going into the job of unearthing this material. The New York Times refers to that banker, Mario Garnero, who's been charged with embezzling a huge private money from the Brazil Invest. And I mentioned Garnero in terms of his relationship to William Simon, former Secretary of the Navy, important cabinet member in almost all administrations of the United States, and his work with George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, and how Kissinger Associates came in as soon as the president-elect was murdered to help, in quotes, get the country back on its feet. And it mentions the contraband that's gone and the semi-precious stones and the emeralds sent to the United States. Then, just almost the end of the article, it says the longest-running drama is something they're opening up now, but which was covered up, was the 1982 kidnapping and killing of a magazine publisher, Mr. Baumgarten, and his wife and the boatman. And they came across papers saying that he was going to be murdered, that he knew he'd be killed, and he actually worked for the National Information Service, which is the pro-government newspaper that he was running. And even though his life was threatened and it was in these notes, this was ignored until the administration changed. And now a district attorney is looking into the case and finds that a member of the information service itself, similar to our USIA or Radio Free Europe or Radio America or the CIA intelligence news part of our intelligence apparatus, a member of that group actually participated in the kidnapping and knew about it. So even though they're talking about corruption, they get right down to the murders. Now, if any of you have any doubt that Samantha Smith's plane just went down because of the weather, then you believe in the Tooth Fairy and you shouldn't be listening to Mae Brussell any further. I believe this was a very good lesson to a young really a child at the time who wrote to Yuri Andropov and said that she thought our countries could coexist. She was invited to the Soviet Union, wanted us to put away our weapons. That poor little thing killed in an airplane crash over Maine, and all the peacekeepers are slaughtered and the warmongers live. You don't see anything like this happening to those people. Another problem that happens every year when school starts is that certain college people with a lot of potential, particularly blacks and Chicanos, are murdered. I've saved these for years. I'll add them up and share them with you sometime. Washington Post has a long story this past week, August 13th, a Harlem puzzle, the death of Edmund Perry. Edmund Perry was shot by a bullet from a policeman that went into him, killed him this summer where he was standing in front of his home in Harlem. He attended Phillips Exeter Academy, the renowned New England preparatory school. He planned to enter Stanford University this fall. He was an engineering student at Cornell University. Gunned down in Harlem and he doesn't have to go to the white school and compete and have the mobility that blacks would have economically and in fields of education and decision making. Many of them, men and women, have these terrible accidents, and this was a police killing just prior to going into Stanford that begins their administration this week, the new semester. Another murder of a peacekeeper, the Sikh leader, I'm sure all of you read that, Harshan Singh Longowal, Longowal, who wanted to get along with Rajiv Gandhi, a moderate who wanted peace. He was gunned down by another Sikh. So long, Mr. Peacekeeper in India, that's what we think of your peace. Meantime, the United States has escalated their funds to Pakistan. Mr. Gandhi is furious about that, and he's furious about the school that trained people to make assassination attempts on him or his friends, and even suspect in the Air India flight. Another Indian was killed, a member of the parliament that was elected last year in December, a close friend of Rajiv Gandhi, Lalit Makan, his wife, and their driver were killed. So even though there's one black dot on the article, there were 3 deaths. You can start adding these up. He was shot, and the suspect in that case, I read in the newspaper, is none other than Lal Singh, mentioned in a newspaper, the Press Trust of India. Lal Singh is wanted in the United States. You know how badly he's wanted. He just slipped out of here. He's wanted in the United States for conspiracy to murder Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi on his visit here in June. He's also prime suspect for last week's murder of Indian parliamentary Lalit Makan and his wife. The police say that he allegedly drove the getaway car. The vehicle is run by him. He used the getaway car, drove that away, and he's wanted. Now, that same person was trained down in Alabama with Mr. Franklin Camper. Franklin Camper made the front page of the Wall Street Journal last week with an article about his seminar on teaching how to cut throats, how to cut ears off, how to torture. It's titled War Games in Alabama's Woods. Franklin Camper trains men to repel invaders. Prep school for mercenaries has notorious graduates. This is the fellow whose camp I mentioned going back to 1981, by April of 81, that I thought had the silencers that tried to kill Ronald Reagan in front of the Hilton Hotel, that involved Nazis and Posse Comitatus. And Mr. Camper has links to the men that tried the invasion of Dominica, the Klan, and the Nazis, also tied to a Texas coup plan run by John Connally and Texans. And Connally, of course, was part of Permindex, the operation that was set up for political assassinations, heads of states such as Mr. Gandhi. And if you have a little free time, you can blow up planes, which they teach to do. And Samantha Smith's plane, I'm sure, got a Edwin Wilson send-off, or he working with our CIA, he was teaching Gaddafi how to do these things, or a Franklin Camper send-off. There's a whole army of people out there in every state now that can do these things. Now, when I was talking about the atomic bomb, the difference between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I didn't have time on that broadcast to talk about the American bomb. Nagasaki was the plutonium bomb. It was dropped 3 days after Hiroshima because that's the one we went into mass production that was cheaper, and we wanted to test the difference in radiation and damage the two could do. But the bomb that fell in the United States in Philadelphia over the black community, made by DuPont with Tovex in it, Tovex, was a bombing that is just as important as Hiroshima and Nagasaki in its own way, dropping bombs in America on citizens. And of course, we test them, such as Jonestown is black, the SLA led by black leader Donald DeFreeze, who worked with the Los Angeles Police Department, in this case Black Homes and the MOVE organization. I mentioned July 29th, this is broadcast number 712, that the team that was down identifying, and of quotes, when I say identify, I'm making fun of that Joseph Mengele charade that took place in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And on that broadcast, I said that Ellis Curley and Ali Hameli and Lowell Levine were being sent from Brazil. Their next big show would be in Philadelphia, where they were going to work on some kind of identification. and they would participate. They described it as a war that took place there, a war with several hundred participants. And I asked then, what in the heck is going on? What are they saying? Well, this past week, there were many articles about the Philadelphia raid. The New York Times, August the 10th, inquiry planned over bombing in Philadelphia. The use of a bomb that contained C-4, a powerful military explosive that has never been allowed in this country. And they said it was a less incendiary device. Killed 11 people, left 250 homeless. And the bomb that was dropped was a fabrication. What they told us they dropped was different than what they dropped. And the New York Times said the police has offered no explanation of the discrepancy. And a group of independent medical examiners hired by the mayor's commission have been brought in because they found an unspent bullet in the body of one of the MOVE members. I said they were shot at close range like the SLA. So I guess these hunky-dory medical team will be the ones in from Sao Paulo, Brazil, who can do a little more damage on the MOVE case. The scandal is the medical examiners, whether it's in Brazil, United States, in Dallas, or in the Los Angeles department where Robert Kennedy was killed, or New York City when Nelson Rockefeller was offed. The medical examiners are part of the problem. There's an editorial in the New York Times, August the 18th, on the medical examiners and the confusion of the inquiry, the contradictions of the city medical examiner's office that said there were no bullets. And then later they find out, yes, in fact, there were bullets in the body of those people, and that they were testing a substance from Tovex, Tovex, that they said was used for mining explosives, but actually was to come right down on their heads and bomb in the United States, and also to test the reaction. And the reaction of the people was go ahead and do it. It was a good thing. You got rid of the fussy neighbors, and American people are literally just asleep to respond to these very important things. Each one of these, as I say, would take an hour broadcast. I'm just running through some of the details, and many of you have seen the MOVE stories. Even Time magazine asks the question, how big was the bomb, and goes into the discrepancies and how it's embarrassing and the superiors are being contradicted. It's not only embarrassing, it's all a bunch of downright lies, and we've been lied to for a long time. Now, another murder to take place not too long from now will have to be Mr. Michael Orlando. He's the one who worked with Raymond Donovan, the Secretary of Labor. The Washington Post has a story August the 9th. Donovan case informant may lose protection. He isn't helping to get Donovan off the hook, and therefore they want to take away his protection, and his attorney is saying that that is a tantamount to signing his death warrant in light of the many murder threats reportedly made against him already. The lawyer says he knew of no obligation on Orlando's part to cooperate with the defense. He was supposed to be working for the prosecution, and he said, I won't do any more testimony there, but I won't help the defense either. So now the Justice Department says take away any security or change of identification. And, of course, 3 to 4 people that we know of, 4 for sure, have been murdered directly involved with this case, but there may be maybe 10 or 12. We don't know. Another article, Donovan firm dropped as responsible bidder. With all of this going on, with his investigation going on and his mob connections known to the Justice Department, to Edwin Meese, the Attorney General, and the whole gang, he's still been reaping millions of dollars. Last week they said that they'll stop giving him a contract for the Transit Authority bid. They paid over millions of dollars rather than give it to him because something is wrong. Now, as far as the Raymond Donovan case goes, and this poor Michael Orlando that they're sacrificing to be murdered, taking away the protection because they want him to switch from the prosecution of the defense, they called in David Crown, former director of the CIA Handwriting Analysis Laboratory, who was testifying on signatures and agreements that were Mr. Orlando's handwriting. Now, Mr. Crown was flown in directly from Sao Paulo, Brazil, working with those other monkeys down there, doing their thing, as far as the Joseph Mengele case goes. So in comes Crown to work on the Raymond Donovan case, and the other 3 were in Philadelphia and are there working on the MOVE case, all involving military operations, assassinations, cover-ups of the highest level, again, that all reach to the Odessa network that is operating very strongly in the United States. Now, I'm going to do 1 or 2 hours on the killer bee. I've outlined it all and worked on it. San Francisco Chronicle had a long story, August the 18th, just this past week, the real fight against the killer bee and why we may lose it. And I traced every city it's been in the United States, where it came from, Africa, and have narrowed it down to a genetic laboratory in none other than Sao Paulo, Brazil, where they're working on genetic experiments, and they went over and got the African bee, and when they were breeding them in Sao Paulo, they were killed by mistake, some of them. So they went back and purposely brought in more African bees, and then they were released. They're opened out of a cage, all of a sudden escaped, and they could travel several hundred miles a year. But these bees in California are inside a pipe in Bakersfield, California, and there's nowhere they could land except to be brought here to California. They were in the Great Lakes up north and in Cleveland, Ohio, but there is no explanation as of this day, and they will affect the pollination of apples and fruits and the crops, and then the infestation that's on them in the East Coast, if it comes here, could damage the crops in California. We have the cheese poisoning, the water poisoning, the watermelon. There's poison in wine. I could go on and on, the food connections. There's so many now. Salmonella, the milk. But the bee thing is very serious, and it came from Brazil. And there have been quite a few articles say those, and we'll do more about that. Now, the question about the president's care keeps persisting. The New York Times has a long article, August 13th, titled, Questions About the Care of President Persist. Now, they know something is wrong. These physicians don't come out and accuse each other, even though the doctors in Philadelphia lied about the move case, and various times you read about people that commit suicide, and the family doesn't believe it. One in New Jersey, they dug up the body and it had 3 bullets in it. Well, questions about the president are being asked. The president's medical problems raise confusion and contradictions, the article says. Medical care one day leads to more questions the next. And they're not satisfied with what happened to Ronald Reagan. They said they're particularly sensitive because at 74, he's the oldest man to hold office. And after he was shot, the assassination attempt, it took many days to confirm that the bullet had come to rest in a section of the lung about an inch from his heart. There was a serious discrepancy in the first public account of the number of blood transfusions. Now, they're talking about that, and I said it was in that blood where Ronald Reagan's future problem would come, and I'm going to do a little more about cancer in a few minutes. The confusions and contradictions then and now might be dismissed as public relations attempts to protect the man in the White House and create the image of an unusually strong person that he can withstand pain without anesthesia. But the confusions and contradictions suggest the possibility of more serious problems about the way the staff has handled Ronald Reagan's treatment. And as I say, that I believe the problem began in the blood and the Secret Service lying, the FBI lying to the surgeons, holding back information. And remember, John Hinckley was a member of the Posse Comitatus with links to the Nazis, the far right in California, in Chicago, in Texas, and those people that would want Reagan, even though he's radical enough, to have George Bush, the CIA director, as president of the United States, and shift this fellow out, because Bush worked with Bobby Inman and also with Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger, and that team for a long time, where this president was a newcomer like Jimmy Carter. He was visible, but he is not the man to take over the problems that there are today or that there were going to be. And so these questions still go back, even in 1985, August the 13th, New York Times, to the care of the blood and the treatment in the hospital in Washington, D.C., and that's where I said the problems began. Now, under the sunny sky of Santa Barbara, I don't know how many of you have seen that town. It's idyllic. It's very pretty. They do have some poor. They have transients that go up and down the coast that sleep on benches in parks, and last year a transient was murdered last December. But the most shocking thing to happen in Santa Barbara, not getting national attention, an article from the Los Angeles Herald, military prep students held in killing. And the insidiousness of this is the Rambo mentality of our president and the people, 2 people at a school, military school in Santa Barbara, who murdered a man sleeping in his sleeping bag in a park. in Santa Barbara. 2 prep students have been accused of murder. One of them was ready to start the Air Force Academy in September in the fall, the other to go to Annapolis to the Navy Academy. They murdered a man, Michael Stevenson, a 29-year-old transient. They went into town with knives. They were going to carry out what they called a guerrilla attack against other youth. Now, this country is having a war. The Aryan nation said as of May the 1st, this country would turn into Vietnam. But these aren't just ordinary kids fighting each other out in a ghetto or in Harlem with nothing to do and a lot of violence around them all their lives. These are 2 young men who stabbed to death a person sleeping in the bench, and then they went back to the dormitory of the school and told them about it. They said they stabbed the man 10 times in the back, then they slit his throat. And the teenagers then left. They left him bleeding to death next to his sleeping bag. Then they went back to the dormitory at the Northwestern Preparatory School, a private school for high school graduates who want to enter the military academies, the elite academies that we taxpayers pay their education for. And they bragged to their friends about what they had done. And the roommates were so surprised that they made bets of $50 or beer that they did it, because the roommates didn't believe it. So the next day, or that evening, they went down and showed some of their friends to win some beer and money that they did, in fact, cut this man's throat and stab him. And the next day, 4 students went to the police and implicated 2 of the suspects, and they showed a knife that was used in the crime and bloody tennis shoes and pants belonging to one of the suspects. And one of the kids who turned them in was the person who was responsible for this story breaking. We don't know how many more there are. The article says that from the L.A. Herald, Northwestern Preparatory School has students that come in from Victoria, Texas, and Palo Alto. The 2 were arrested, but those are the future admirals and generals and Air Force high officers who go on in the world having tasted and smelled blood and brag and make bets in a town like Santa Barbara and aspiring to high offices in this government, because if you go to those schools, you usually end up in a high office. Now, James Kirkpatrick had an article this week on one of my favorite subjects that I fear. This was August the 12th, 1985, taking precautions against a runaway constitutional convention. Now, his reasons for not having it, and he talks about the budget that isn't balanced and so forth, are different than mine. I know that the president is purposely going over and spending anything he wants and doesn't care about the budget. And David Stockman and others say the purpose is to pull us back to the pre-Franklin Roosevelt period, get back to the Herbert Hoover economy. But it's more than that. Roosevelt's long gone, and it has more to do with making Henry Kissinger president of the United States, with William Graham of the defense of Daniel Graham. There's Billy the preacher. I'm talking about Daniel Graham, Defense Intelligence Agency of the Star Wars, sharing his offices in Washington, D.C. with former advisor staff to the plans officer of the Pentagon, Fritz Kramer, and his proteges, Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger, in the news with every other article, their face and name. And Haig is in all these various scandals that are coming out now, and I have to share more details on those 2 that Jonathan Whitney wrote for Wall Street Journal on Francisco Pazienza, Michael Ledeen, Ronald Reagan, and Prime Minister from Italy, Mr. Craxi, having Pazienza locked up. So this scandal, Pazienza locked up, so the scandal doesn't go up to the White House, up to Reagan and Ledeen and Haig, the advisors to the State Department, the Defense Department. These scandals are brewing, and Kissinger and Haig are proteges of mentor Fritz Kramer. Haig's name is in a lot of articles, and another I'll be mentioning in a minute. That the pot is boiling. So I think they want to change the Constitution to make Henry Kissinger president. For whatever reason, Kirkpatrick is saying, be careful of a runaway constitutional convention. Now, one of the stories, there are several large stories going on simultaneously that I have mentioned before, and we'll outline it to simplify them for yourself and for you and for myself. But I do want to call it attention again, because these items are getting more exposure in the media, and you can start collecting articles if you're interested and accumulate them until I sort them out along with you and add up what is happening. One has to do with the arrest of Paul Selocha, Seklocha. Two long articles, one in Spotlight, August 26, 1985. I don't usually give them as a source, but they're making connections that David Embry has made to this group and to P2 and weapons and gun running with offices and agents in Los Angeles, California. The other is a long article in the San Jose Mercury, which isn't syndicated, but dated August the 11th, Smuggling Suspect, Dedicated Reporter, or Shadowy Spy. Now, the article in Spotlight brings in the names Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig and very top people from the Defense Intelligence Agency, such as Lieutenant General Eugene F. Tighe, Tighe Jr., who headed the DIA in 1977 to 1982, took over the role of Daniel Graham when Daniel Graham then went to become the pusher for the famous Star Wars that is breaking up our possible détente or ability to coexist with the Soviet Union in any way but an arms race. And so this article about Sciascia makes the connections of people who do link directly to Francesco Pazienza, to the P2, to Henry R. San operation of guns and drugs, and it involves people from our Defense Department whose names I will detail for you. The other article, the Smuggling Suspect one from the San Jose Mercury, is a long story about Mr. Sciascia, who, among other things, besides selling $75 million worth of arms to Iran, it publishes up in San Jose area a magazine for the Defense Department, two magazines, one called Military Science and Technology, the other the Journal of CI, Counterintelligence Countermeasures, which has authors from the top Defense Department science and intelligence experts and writers working for Mr. Sciascia. He used the name Cutter, Professor Paul Cutter, as a spy. He taught at Berkeley. He joined the U.S. Information Agency as a tour guide. He was picked up in the Soviet Union as a spy. And among other things, the San Jose Mercury story has, which I'll repeat for you again at another time, that writers for the magazine include David Atlee Phillips, former chief of the CIA's Latin American operations, David Oberg, a best-selling author in aerospace on Space Shuttle. I'll give you the other names later, but David Atlee Phillips is the gentleman who is suing Don Freed for his allegations that he was behind and part of the murder of Salvador Allende and the coup that took place. He was very much part in Chile of that entire operation. And David Atlee Phillips also founded the magazine of the Survivalist. He was one of those people that I described early this year in February, March, of his role with Survivalist magazines. Now, the story of Charles Ng and the Wisely, it's Wilseyville, Wilseyville bodies, also in Cavaleras County, those two difficult names to remember. The common denominator between the mass murders of Charles Ng and Leonard Lake with their Nazi bunkers, these killers, is a woman, Claralyn Balzas, Claraln Balazs, who was married to the late Leonard Lake, who bit the cyanide bullet when he was arrested, and Charles Ng is protected in Canada. Now, the common denominator between them, the law office of Chris Carroll and Stan Rosansky, is representing Claralyn Balzas, that is their attorney, and her family owns the property where they experiment, cut people up, and did these murders. And the attorney for the case of Paul Sciascia, with the highest echelon of military, is also the office of Chris Carroll and Stan Rosansky. They have more in common than just attorneys. They're big cases that involve mass murder, experimentations, work with Nazis, work with death squads in South America, and also a possible common denominator is an article I read in the San Francisco Examiner just last month. Police are looking for a San Diego drug dealer with links to Wilseyville bodies. And I'll detail that for you because I still am questioning the John DeLorean narcotics, the possible links to the Nazis, and also the drug dealers in San Diego and the missing gold of Mr. Dominelli. From Brazil, the scandals that go down from San Diego to Brazil and the lawyers in common and the way the Charles Ane case has been hushed up in Canada where he went for protection. Now, that is a big ball of wax. I'm just saying that through the globe, I've taken certain stories and just copied from my atlas the places on the globe and marked arrows where these particular people meet and what they have in common. So when you come across articles on the Iranian weapons, the sale of Iranian weapons, a trial where they'll all obviously plead something guilty, like Mr. Walker, so there won't be a public trial, there are more things in common between these two huge stories than meets the mind, and I'll do more about them later. In the meanwhile, we'll take a 1-minute break and go on to some other individual and mass murders and just summarize what in the heck has been going on in this country, around the world. It is very serious, and I don't think anybody, or hardly anybody, with the exception of a handful of people, such as David Emory and Nip Tuck and Charles Spears in Texas, have that full awareness of how this thing is going and where it's going and how it came to be. As I say, we'll take a 1-minute break, and then I'll be back with you to discuss some more of these activities. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This is part 2 of a program called World Watchers, and if you missed the first half, listen to the second. You can send for these broadcasts if you write to me. All correspondence should be self-addressed, stamped envelope, and if you're local or even if you're driving through and out of town, I'm enlisted in the telephone book, the only Mae Brussell, not Mabe, Mae, M-A-E, Brussell. You can call and ask questions, and if you missed, as I say, the first part of the program, or want a copy of this broadcast or the sheet that goes with it, with the sources of information. Now, just to show or prove to you that I don't think the assassinations and the mass murders are anything new, we've known they've gone on for a long time. I just want to cite one article that was in the newspaper last week. It was called Ceremonies to Honor Will Rogers, and it was about the airplane crash that he had 50 years ago with Wiley Post. And the article from the Washington Times, August the 5th, said, the cause of the accident that killed Rogers and Mr. Post was never determined. And my father used to be on the radio every Sunday night in KHJ for years in Los Angeles, and I used to go down to the station with him. I liked to watch him do it. Maybe that's where I picked up the interest in radio work, but I wasn't conscious of it at the time. And the person that followed him on the air after his broadcast was Will Rogers. So we used to spend a lot of time together at the station before and after the broadcast. And we were taking a trip to Alaska. I was 13 years old, and that summer we were going up to the Arctic Circle, and we were going to take boats up there, which we did. And Will Rogers and his family were going to go and take the same trip. We were going to do it together. And then at the last minute, he decided that he would fly with Wiley Post, the famous pilot. And so he took this trip himself, August 15th, 1935. I believe we were up in Seattle. We took a train from Los Angeles up to Seattle when we just got word that he had been killed in that plane crash. Instead of going on the train with us in the boat, he took the plane. Years later, when I was helping a person, some of you know who it is, write a book, trying to help her write about her experiences in Hollywood, she was telling me about Howard Hughes and the competition of Howard Hughes with Wiley Post, and how Howard wanted to be a hero and make the round-the-world record. And Wiley Post was his biggest competitor. It'd be interesting to look up the details of those flights and when Howard went around the world and did, in fact, win that contest. There was no more Wiley Post because Wiley was dead. And in the course of researching the life of Howard Hughes, I came across 6 or 8 people that had untimely deaths, just as the news story this past week that Lyndon Johnson had ordered the death of Judge Marshall in 1961 or 62 because he would link Lyndon Johnson to organized crime or hanky-panky, not the crime syndicate so much as illegal activities of Bobby Baker and Billy Sol Estes, and he wanted to continue to be the vice president of the United States. If not, of course, we know what happened in Dallas, and he became president. But before Dallas, he had a history of wiping out. There was an earlier story about somebody that was killed, and then this story just 2 weeks ago about Judge Marshall, who in fact was murdered, and they tried to say it was suicide. Again, the medical reports in collusion with the murderers, the autopsy reports in collusion So don't trust your medical examiner or what they say all the time. They give you a quick answer. So I found that people all around Howard Hughes were dying, young actors, actresses, people who competed with him. And I asked at the time, I said, are we writing a book about obituaries? And I could run down some of those names for you sometime. But one of those that was a competitor with Howard Hughes was Wiley Post. And just as Lyndon Johnson didn't want a judge to live because he may prosecute a case that would rub off on him, you can see that people do have motives and do get away with these things. And as this article said, in commemorating his death 50 years ago, the cause of the accident that killed him and Mr. Post was never determined. Now, talking about determinations and accidents, or man-made accidents, there was a story August 19th of the Monterey Herald, carried on the wire service from Cincinnati, study due of inmates injected with cancer. A New York medical center is attempting to find out what happened to 200 Ohio prison inmates who were injected with cancer cells 23 years ago. That would be 1962 that they were given this cancer. I call this the Jack Ruby cancer with a question mark, because 3 years later, Jack Ruby would be an inmate and he would get cancer. And I'll do more about that in 1 second. At the request of Representative Willis D. Gradison, a representative of Ohio, they've asked Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center about what happened to those studies that they did. Chester Southam, a doctor now in Philadelphia, said he didn't think anything unusual happened to these men, but there's been no follow-up study, so they directed Sloan Kettering. Doctor had gotten between $300,000 and $500,000 from the National Cancer Institute, and some of you don't remember the early broadcasts I did on cancer 2 or 3 years ago when I said that William Donovan was one of the first civilians put on the National Cancer Institute right immediately after the end of World War II. And, of course, Donovan and his OSS and his links to SS Karl Wolff and Heinrich Himmler and the Nazis, they got out through the riot line and into our universities and space agencies and so forth, is notorious. So why have a super spy like Donovan going into the National Cancer Institute? And this was a question of injecting these people. 200 Ohio prisoner inmates were given cancer cells in 1962 and have never been followed up. And it just came out recently. Now, I always call Jack Ruby's quick death. If you want to die of 3 or 4 weeks of a cancer, that's a Jack Ruby. If you want a long one that takes 3.5 to 4 years, that could be Martha Mitchell or Ronald Reagan. Los Angeles Herald Examiner, Tuesday, January the 3rd, 1967. Jack Ruby dies, loses fight to cancer. Ruby was moved to the hospital, the Parkland Hospital, where he's been suffering from cancer since December the 9th. He died on January the 2nd, so the report was January the 3rd. That was his 3-week cancer. At the hospital, his illness was first diagnosed as pneumonia, and then cancer, which had spread into the lymph glands, the lungs, the pancreas, and they said surgery would do no good. His friend, the attorney Elmer Gertz from Chicago, came to see him. He said Ruby was 55 at Christmas, just before Christmas, and he looked like a man 80 years old. Another headline, Jack Ruby he told the family that he was inflicted with cancer. This comes out of Dallas, and interestingly enough, on the back of the story of cancer, this was January the 3rd, 1967, that he said he was given cancer in the prison. On the very back page of that paper, the Los Angeles Examiner, is a picture of Ronald Reagan smiling. This is the day that Jack Ruby died. Governor Reagan smiles as the legislature applauds him. He's honored by a Senator Burns and Mrs. Unruh. Now, Jack Ruby's the man who wouldn't extradite Edgar Eugene Bradley, who worked with the Klan, the Nazis, with the Reverend Gale of the Identity Movement, with the Aryan Nations, Mr. Swift, who was the man behind the Aryan Nations and the Identity Group, and with Gerald L.K. Smith and the anti-Semites that were pushing Reagan to be president, and I can cite those later, but this is mostly about deaths now. But on the back of this is a Reagan smiling, and the same day it said Ruby told his relatives cancer was inflicted. When Jack Ruby first learned he had cancer, he was convinced it was inflicted on him. He said the cancer germs were introduced into his system secretly somewhere in the Dallas jail. While he experienced difficulty in breathing early in December, he was taken to the hospital, and they said he had pneumonia. And he said there must have been mustard gas or something seeped into his cell because the diagnosis was changed to cancer, and he knew that the germs and not the gas were used to murder him. He himself was convinced to the end that he was the victim of a conspiracy, and he told his family that he knew that something came to him in the jail, that he had the cancer. January the 2nd, 1967. Relatives believe Ruby lacked care in jail. The handful of relatives and lawyers who saw Jack Ruby just before he was admitted to Parkland Hospital with cancer believe he didn't receive adequate medical attention. Ruby was not taken to the hospital until Sheriff Decker expressed grave concern about his condition after visiting him in the cell. He was transferred to the hospital one day before a private physician was called in by his brother and sister who was supposed to see him. Then nobody could see him. They quick put him in Parkland Hospital and locked him up. Dr. John Callahan, the assistant county health officer, apparently saw Ruby frequently but never examined him. He had never been examined since 1964 until December the 9th when Sheriff Decker came. He was having coughing problems in the jail and spells 2 months before he was taken to the hospital, and he was unable to keep food down most of the time, which could be a food poisoning with something, just as the radiation was put into Karen Silkwood's refrigerator, obviously to rub off on food that she's going to eat. She's not going to eat the sides of the refrigerator, so it gets into the food. If she wasn't going to be killed by a car accident, she was going to be killed by something that they bothered to put. The Geiger count showed high incidence of radiation in her refrigerator. So he's captive inside the jail, and he starts vomiting. This article says almost everyone who saw Ruby during the last weeks agreed he looked very ill the last weeks, but not until his sister, wanted to handle it. Apparently, no one is willing to explain who was chiefly responsible for seeing that Ruby was given a more thorough medical examination or that he was transferred to a hospital where some specialists could treat him. Ruby's brother Earl, who lived in Detroit, and his sister Eva Grant visited him December the 4th and 5th, and they thought he was seriously ill, and they asked for a private physician. They thought at first the doctor came, Dr. Callahan, thought he might have pneumonia, and as we found out to our dismay, he happened to have cancer. Sheriff Bill Decker said, "It is Dr. Pickett's duty to permit inspection of the records, and they refused to make the medical records of Jack Ruby available." Now here, Sloan Kettering and our government and the Medical Cancer Institute is working on 200 prisoners in 1962, and 5 years later in 1967, Ruby is vomiting, and they tell him it's pneumonia, and then they locked up the records, and they said, "You can't see the records." They refused to make the medical records open. "You're not going to put me in the medical profession," Bill Decker said, and Dr. Pickard and Callahan said, "We're not going to let you see them." Pickard said, "It's up to us and the sheriff and he. We're not going to make the medical records available. We don't have to keep any records. We only record what medication is given, so if he didn't get medication, but they don't record, of course, what's in his food." Ruby told one of his lawyers, Elmwood Gertz, he had not had a thorough examination since November 63 when he was jailed. "Looking back, it occurs to me that he was seriously ill. Looking back, he was vomiting and so forth, but he was put in for pneumonia." And as I say, the day that he died, January the 3rd, Ronald Reagan is laughing. There's an article about a planned invasion of Cuba with Rolando Masferher in the same paper. He worked with the CIA and the anti-Castro Cubans in the plot to kill John Kennedy. He formerly was an aide to Mr. Batista of Cuba. And at that time, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was doing their work. Speaking of death, Rolando Masferher was blown away on a ship, along with other people like William Sullivan of the FBI of Division 5, and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, and Carlos Prios Sequeras, the former president of Cuba, and George de Mohrenschildt. There were a lot of murders at that time of primary witnesses, and here's Masferher's name, working with anti-Castro Cubans trying to kill Fidel Castro in 1967, and next to it is the smiling Ronald Reagan, the man who wouldn't extradite Mr. Bradley, who did work with the Nazis and who himself was supported by the Nazis put into office as governor. Interesting obituary, not a murder, but a natural death of a man on in years, 85 years old. Max Cutler dies. This is from the New York Times, July 14th. He developed a treatment for brain tumors in 1930, a cancer expert. Dr. Max Cutler, one of America's early pioneers in the campaign against cancer, died in Camarillo, California. In 1920, he worked widely with cancer experts. 1920, that goes way back, on radiology and surgery research, and he worked on tumors at the Chicago Tumor Institute. He was the director until 1952. He was affiliated with the University of Chicago. He first made use in this country of a technique learned in Paris of concentration radiotherapy, maximum feasible radiation, where they implant filtered radium inside the brain and left for periods ranging from 24 hours to 21 days. In 1932, he and Dr. Loyal Davis, that is the stepfather and the staunch conservative, the close stepfather of Nancy Reagan Davis. He was a partner with Dr. Loyal Davis and presented a new treatment for the malignancy of brain cancer, working with Dr. Davis, who was a neurosurgeon. And, of course, I did broadcast going back last year on the chronology of Nancy Davis and Ronald Reagan, their relationship and their political. I'll have to do more next week on Nancy and Ronnie Errol Flynn in lieu of the article just this week. I forgot to mention that. Came out in the Sunday San Jose Mercury. Ronald Reagan, informer for the FBI against the communists. This is while he was working with pro-Nazi Errol Flynn, and the early proof that he was an informer has been coming out in the news. And so we'll do more on Nancy Davis and her father, who worked with Charles Willoughby from the Kriegs Academy in Germany, Mr. Wiedenbach, and General MacArthur. And in the Philippines, her father, as a doctor, worked with Willoughby, who comes to Dallas and is on the board of Young Americans for Freedom with Ronald Reagan. All of this, these shenanigans and interweaving of people is very important because of the politics of cancer. This was a man that worked with her daddy and experimented putting 21 days of radium into people's brains. You just wonder who he was putting that into and what they looked like when they were through with 21 days of radium. He retired in Beverly Hills, California in 1979, the year that Joseph Mengele was supposed to have been buried. 79, that year will always jump at me now to see what was happening then. He just passed away, but had a lot of experience with cancer. Another murder took place, an important political murder at Monte Carlo, just recently reported in the news as of July. The murder described as a Jean le Carré thriller, which means intelligence, of course. A cloak and dagger drama is described in the Washington Times of Shah Nawaz Bhutto, the son of the former president of Pakistan, the first elected Prime Minister, Ali Bhutto. He was representing a democracy. It didn't last very long, and his son was murdered in Monte Carlo. The family said he was poisoned. An autopsy was ordered, and of course it was passed up. The scandal in Monte Carlo has been going on for a month, and Mr. Zia has allowed the body to return to Pakistan to probably make peace with the Bhuttos, because it's easy to have a dead president-elect buried there than it is to deal with him while he's outside the country. His sister has gone back to Pakistan, the daughter of the late Prime Minister. She's standing a chance of jail or house arrest. She's been fighting that country ever since her father's unfair execution. And again, it was Henry Kissinger in our State Department that had arranged the murder of Bhutto so that drug dealer Zia could run Pakistan. And he's more heavily in drugs now than ever, and he's getting more money from the United States State Department. Now, the opposite side of that coin is the Shah's son. The same time that the Washington Times describes the death of Mr. Bhutto, killed in poison in Monte Carlo, a large article in the Washington Times Reverend Moon's paper, the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, and his supporters plan for post-Khomeini regime. Now, the reason I think that these top generals and those people that I mentioned were sending the weapons to Iran is to get ready for a revolution. They're not really for the Shah, but for everyone that Shah gets. Khomeini gets. They're getting ready for the Shah's son to return back to Iran. We need that to make war against the Soviet Union. I mentioned that before. So this article is a long article on he's getting ready to come into the post-Khomeini regime. This is a father that worked with his grandfather with Adolf Hitler, his father having the Savak, the treacherous torture machinery, the collection of drug traffickers, assassination teams, and secret police. He wants to return to Iran, and the answer of why these people worked, David Atlee Phillips and so forth, worked so closely with and the Pentagon, with the people sending the weapons to Iran, is to get them there to get ready for the Shah's son to be there. So Shah's son is alive, despite all the death threats and everything. You notice that he's still around, and Paul Selosha and his gang are pouring over $6 million worth of weapons, he brags about, pouring weapons into Iran so that they'll be stashed away. Khomeini, if he sees $1 million worth, he thinks he's lucky. And the other $5 million are for the revolution. So Mr. Bhutto's son is dead, and the Shah's son is ready to come back, and the peace-loving child is dead in an airplane crash, and the warmongers continue, and the students from the military academy are cutting throats, and Rambo is selling tickets, and so it goes. Now, there's a very important article in the Los Angeles Times on the opinion page, August the 18th, a week ago last Sunday, by Thomas Powers. Now, Powers isn't a leftist, and I want to go over this as closely as I can for the time remaining. He's a man who wrote, the author of The Man Who Kept the Secrets, Richard Helms and the CIA. So in order to work with Helms, you have to have top secret clearances. Helms was also an advisor in Iran after he left the CIA. And most of you know the career of Richard Helms and his activities in the Central Intelligence Agency, and there are a lot of good books out about it. But he's writing about a problem which is out of control in the sense of foreign affairs, and it's out of control in the sense of domestic affairs. And it gets, again, to people like David Atlee Phillips and John Singh Laub with their soldier of fortunes, their advisors to these military trainings for movies, to military coups all over the world. He writes an article, The Control of the Contras is a Hazardous Illusion. And what Thomas Powers says is that Allen Dulles tried to convince John Kennedy to have a secret army organization, a private army. If we couldn't send our troops to kill Castro and go into Cuba, use our secret army organization. And he told him that if you deny them the chance to fight Castro, they might fight us. Now, that is a very revealing statement by Thomas Powers, that Allen Dulles is literally saying, we will have a revolution in the United States if you don't let them go and get Castro. Now, John Kennedy pulled back from the Bay of Pigs. Allen Dulles was a member of the Warren Commission. He was also the CIA director before Kennedy had removed him. He used his anti-Castro Cubans, his Russians, his Nazis, Clay Shaw with his links to Permindex and Bormann in South America, and Marina Oswald from Minsk. Those networks, he used all of them, Division 5 of the FBI. Allen Dulles used them, and they were, in fact, a part of the plot to kill John Kennedy, and he was saying, if you don't let them go into Cuba, they will kill us, and they've killed Kennedy and a lot of people since, and also links to Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and all of these various murders, and now to the survivalists and to the Charles Ng people and the Rambo mentality that are nesting all over the United States and throughout the world. Now, this article said the CIA created a massive army for Ronald Reagan. He put more money in with William Casey from OSS, a Knight of Malta, from his war experiences in World War II, right to Washington. He has created a massive army for Ronald Reagan. And what Thomas Powers says is that they're now advised by the National Security Council. And that's another scandal I could do an hour or two with you, and I'm sure you've seen these articles. And they're now funded by private individuals and organizations. So we have created, out of the laboratory, like AIDS, We have created a cancer bigger than what Mr. Dean, John Dean, told Richard Nixon. There's a cancer on the presidency. And Power says to control this group, this triangle group, is an illusion. 3 loose cannons are on the deck. And he cites them again. The Contras, the army that won't be willing to give up and call it a day. If the Contadoras say don't fight, if the South American countries say don't fight, they are going to be willing to kill every person in Nicaragua, every peasant in El Salvador, every Indian in Guatemala. The Contras are not going to stop, and any person who asks for a land reform or a privilege will be knocked out as a Soviet agent of some kind. The Contras have been formed. They are a growth of the army that Allende blackmailed Kennedy. If you don't use them, they'll use us, and now it's time for them to come to us. The second group, the National Security Council, which he says have now got the taste of secret wars without kibitzing from Congress. And that is one of the primary things I've talked to you and shared on the radio for years, was the creation of the National Security Council. It doesn't matter what man you represent, who you elect in, he will be overridden because the so-called national security experts will say, we know. That's the argument for bringing a national security advisor in El Salvador with the Contras at this time. It was in the New York Times and other papers, a quotation, Congress doesn't know what should be done. These elected people have no power to stop this machinery because they've given them the funds and they've fallen for all this anti-Soviet propaganda. So the National Security Council. And the third is the private funding that goes into these private armies. Now, he didn't mention it, but one is Reverend Moon, with close ties to Taiwan, the World Anti-Communist League, the Vatican, the Knights of Malta, Casey, Alexander Haig, Vernon Walters, William Buckley, William Shakespeare, the armies of the Knights of Malta. Claire Luce is one. I can cite them over and again for you. I should update it, who these people, and remind you, William Simon, who's messing around with the financial affairs down in Brazil, where Neves was murdered. Vernon Walters also with his tentacles in Brazil, there when the first military dictatorship was put in by the CIA. And Alexander Haig and J. Peter Grace, with his links to Otto Ambros and I.G. Farben and the Nazi extermination, mass extermination. Why would he wince now? So what you have are the fundings of what they call private groups, the pharmaceuticals and businesses. And Mr. Power says the danger is that they will expect a reward from their grateful president, who's showing his, this Mr. Mancha who came in from Grenada, who had Mr. Bishop murdered, and he will give them business and profits. And also, when they overthrow the countries and turn them into total dictatorships, they can take their profits again out of the bananas and the sugar and keep making the real Coke and the new Coke and the old Coke and the Pepsi generation, and afford to give millions of dollars to promote the Pepsis and the Cokes, because they have raped these countries and starved these people and are making wars upon the native populations there. Now, Power says this miserable but familiar mess is best understood as a constitutional crisis triggered by the inherent difficulties of running a global foreign policy in a democracy. He says when the governors and the governed do not fear the same things, so that those that governing us, Mr. McFarlane and Mr. Weinberger, Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and that gang, when they get together, they decide what we need to do. Mr. Brzezinski is being brought back in to the White House just this past week. And Thomas Power says the plain fact is that the American people parted long ago on the subject of Soviet threats. And you see, when we want peace, that's just forget it. He's going to break up every peace conference. Reagan's doing it now. He said, we have parted. Foreign policy makers in Washington have been worried about the Soviet subversion for 40 years. And this goes back to the early deals, the meetings before Potsdam, where the top German Nazis were meeting with Alan Dulles of the Warren Commission, with John J. McCloy of the Warren Commission, with Henry Stimson, the former Secretary of War, a rabid anti-Semite, and with these multinational corporations. The Soviet threat is the thing that made them have a national security advisor. It was set up by Adolf Hitler's team, and it is the biggest threat to our country and to what is happening to us, because these people are beginning their murders in this country, wiping out the plane crashes, the deaths, the bunkers, the tortures, the airplane crashes, the links to the schools, the 12 schools or more of mercenaries, directly linked to possible atomic explosions and so forth. The Contras, the National Security Council, and the private funding have combined in a way that are responsible for these murders that go way, way back and up to the present time. The mentality of getting away with murders was done by private individuals also, like maybe Howard Hughes or Lyndon Johnson, who knew if somebody's in my way, just kill them. But the judges and the coroners went along with it. And once you begin to pile those bodies, the thing begins to smell. I have said over and over again, the Constitution, up till World War II, the 40 years ago that they're talking about, had the executive, the judicial, and the legislative balance. It used to have. After World War II, Reinhard Gehlen was brought to this country. He and the top Nazis formed the National Security Council, which took all decisions from all elected members of Senate and Congress, and they decided in their heads, along with the top Gestapo chiefs of World War II and British intelligence, what is national security. This organization negated all congressional and presidential decisions and opinions, and the president takes vacation. The national security advisor is in the next room. If he's in a hospital, the national security advisor is there, or the chief of staff, Mr. Reagan, Regan, who then meets with the national security advisor. And then to top it, with the Contras and with the national security and the private funds, people like retired generals such as John Singlaub appear, who has entree to the National Security Council, to the Knights of Malta, to the private funding, to the highest echelon of the military directing these affairs, and then he sets up a magazine with Robert Brown called Soldier of Fortune, and David Atlee Phillips sets up The Survivalist. So they mount their attack to prepare to get rid of us, those rhombos, when the time comes when there's no more battles in Central and South America. And the more they win, the meaner they get, and the more they lose, the meaner they get. And my time is up, so I can't continue this. But this is a sad time for this country. There are a lot of good articles and a lot of terrible stories, but the time is out now, so I have to stop, and I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell. You take care, and keep your spirits up if you can. Bye-bye.